A City in Fear, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Los Angeles in the summer of 1984 was a city alive with contradictions. Sun-soaked beaches and darkened alleys, movie stars and homelessness, opportunity and danger lurking in the shadows. While the days were bright and hot, the nights brought with them an uneasy stillness. The city already carried scars from the violent crimes of the 1970s, and yet nothing could have prepared it for the terror that was about to descend upon it. During that sweltering summer, something sinister began moving silently through the streets at night. Something more terrifying than even the most hardened Angelinos had ever encountered. Residents spoke of a shadow that seemed to glide from one neighborhood to the next. There were whispers of footsteps heard outside bedroom windows, fleeting glimpses of a dark figure retreating into the night. People reported the eerie feeling of being watched, and worse yet, the knowledge that someone was hunting, that someone was Richard Ramirez. To the press, he would come to be known as the Night Stalker, a name that perfectly captured the creeping dread he inspired. To his victims, he was far more than a figure of speech. He was the nightmare made flesh, a predator without pity who brought death to their doorsteps. Early life, El Paso. Richard Leyva Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, a leap day in El Paso, Texas, as if marked from the very beginning as someone out of step with the ordinary. He was the youngest of 5 children born to Julian and Mercedes Ramirez, a working-class Mexican-American couple who struggled to provide for their family. Their home life was turbulent, weighed down by poverty, rigid expectations, and simmering violence. Julian Ramirez, once a policeman in Juarez, Mexico, had moved to Texas and become a laborer on the Santa Fe Railroad. He was a proud man with a fiery temper, known for his harsh discipline that often crossed the line into brutality. Mercedes worked in a boot factory, even while she was pregnant with Richard, inhaling toxic chemicals on the job, chemicals that some later suggested may have damaged her unborn son's developing brain. Richard's childhood was punctuated by trauma and injury. As a toddler, he was quiet and withdrawn, avoiding the company of others. At just 2 years old, a heavy dresser toppled onto him, knocking him unconscious. At 5, he suffered another severe blow to the head when a swing struck him in the temple. Both incidents left him dazed, and in the years that followed, he began to experience epileptic seizures that continued into his teenage years. Those who study criminal behavior often point to childhood head injuries as risk factors for later violence, particularly damage to the parts of the brain responsible for regulating impulse control, emotional response, and empathy. Whether or not these injuries sealed Richard's fate, they became part of the story of a boy who was already slipping away from the world around him. At school, Richard was unremarkable academically, but stood out for his odd demeanor. Teachers described him as shy and distant, rarely making eye contact and preferring to sit alone. Other children teased him for his dirty clothes and withdrawn nature. But behind his quiet exterior, something darker was brewing, an inner world shaped by fear, pain, and a fascination with death. The influence of Miguel. When Richard was 12, his life took another dark turn when he became close with his older cousin Miguel Ramirez, known as Mike. Miguel was a decorated Vietnam veteran who had returned to El Paso carrying more than just physical scars. He also carried a collection of photographs, trophies of the atrocities he committed during the war. For Richard, Miguel was a charismatic and dangerous figure who became both mentor and corrupter. Miguel regaled him with vivid stories of his time in the jungle, tales of ambushes and killings, but it was the photographs that made the strongest impression. Images of raped and mutilated women, decapitated heads, and soldiers' bodies posed in grotesque arrangements. These were not tales of heroism, but of domination and cruelty, and they fascinated young Richard. Miguel also taught Richard practical skills: how to stalk prey, how to move silently, how to kill quickly and without hesitation. He introduced him to marijuana and LSD and began to indoctrinate him with the belief that women were nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. One day, the twisted lessons turned into horrifying reality when Miguel, during an argument with his wife, pulled out a handgun and shot her point blank in the face. Richard stood nearby, watching as the woman crumpled to the floor, lifeless, her blood pooling on the kitchen linoleum. Witnessing such a brutal act, a man destroying the person closest to him, shattered whatever innocence Richard still possessed. It left him with a lasting impression that violence was not just acceptable, but inevitable. After Miguel was institutionalized for the murder, Richard became even more detached from his family and peers. He began sleeping in cemeteries to avoid his father's rages. He delved deeper into drugs, seeking escape in the haze of cocaine, LSD, and inhalants. He also became increasingly fascinated with the occult, finding in Satanism a reflection of the chaos and anger roiling inside him. He began breaking into homes, stealing what he could and peeping through women's windows. At first it was curiosity. Soon it became compulsion, a new path. By his late teens, Richard had dropped out of school completely. He drifted through odd jobs and petty crime, never staying in one place for long. The streets became his home, and drugs his constant companion. The more he drifted, the more his behavior escalated. The crimes that started as petty theft grew bolder. He developed a skill for breaking and entering, slipping into homes unnoticed and leaving without a trace. He found a certain thrill in moving through strangers' homes, touching their belongings, standing over their beds while they slept, feeling the surge of power that came from invading their most private spaces. But theft alone could no longer satisfy him. He hungered for something more, a rival in Los Angeles. Sometime in the early 1980s, Richard Ramirez made his way to Los Angeles, the sprawling metropolis where the line between glamour and decay was razor thin. To him, Los Angeles was a playground of anonymity, a city teeming with strangers, where no one knew his name and no one would miss a few more shadows. When he arrived, he was a thin, disheveled young man in his early 20s, addicted to cocaine and LSD, and often homeless. Yet beneath the quiet, almost meek exterior was a growing hunger for control, for blood, for the power that came from instilling fear. At first, he survived by stealing. He broke into homes with increasing frequency, honing his craft until he could slip in and out like a ghost. He learned to disable locks silently, to move through rooms without waking the sleeping occupants, to vanish before anyone knew he was there. But it wasn't enough. He craved more, not just to enter people's homes, but to dominate the people themselves, to make them feel the same fear and helplessness he had once felt. And so, in the summer of 1984, Richard Ramirez crossed the threshold from thief to killer. The city that had taken him in would soon come to know his name and to dread it. The Night Stalker's origins were forged in pain, fear, and violence. But Los Angeles had no idea what was coming. It was about to become his hunting ground, a trail of blood across California. In the early hours of June 28, 1984, the heat in Los Angeles was oppressive, but it wasn't the weather that kept residents awake. Something far more chilling had begun to stir. That night, 79-year-old Jenny Vinkow was found brutally murdered in her apartment in Glassell Park. Her throat had been slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Her body was discovered by her son, who lived in the same building. She had been stabbed repeatedly, and there were signs her apartment had been ransacked. The horror of that crime, though brutal, was still seen by police as a random act, until the pattern began to emerge. Over the course of the next year, the man who would become known as the Night Stalker unleashed a spree of violence and terror that would rival the most infamous serial killers in American history. He moved silently through neighborhoods across Los Angeles and San Francisco, slipping into homes like smoke, often choosing his victims at random. Young or old, wealthy or working class, it made no difference. Ramirez operated like a predator with no pattern, no remorse, and no clear motivation other than cruelty and chaos. No one was safe. The terror Ramirez inspired stemmed from one chilling reality. There was no pattern. He didn't target a specific race, gender, or age. Victims included couples in bed, children in their rooms, elderly women in quiet homes. Ramirez broke into homes in affluent suburbs and working-class neighborhoods alike, scaling walls, slipping through windows, entering unlocked doors. Some nights he would kill. Other nights he would rape and let his victim live, forcing them to declare their loyalty to Satan. Sometimes he simply left after assaulting his victims, whispering, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." His unpredictability created a paralyzing fear across the state. Parents kept children home from school. Gun sales surged. Hardware stores sold out of locks, deadbolts, and motion lights. Entire neighborhoods started organizing night watches. Windows were nailed shut. People slept with bats or knives under their pillows. The tools of terror. Ramirez was not bound to one method of killing. His weapon was whatever was at hand. A revolver, a knife, a tire iron, a hammer. One night he might shoot a victim at close range. Another night he would bludgeon or stab. He sometimes gagged his victims or tied them up with telephone cords. Occasionally he would draw pentagrams, symbols of his self-professed allegiance to Satan, on walls or on the bodies of his victims. This randomness made him especially hard to track. He was not ritualistic in the way many serial killers are. There were no calling cards besides his casual invocation of the devil and the wordless horror he left behind. The crimes multiply. Here are a few of the many attacks he carried out. March 17th, 1985, Maria Hernandez, 22, was attacked outside her home in Rosemead. Ramirez shot her in the face, but the keys she held up deflected the bullet. She survived. Inside the home, her roommate, Dale Okazaki, was not so lucky. Ramirez found her hiding behind a counter and shot her execution style in the forehead. March 27th, 1985, Ramirez broke into the Whittier home of Vincent Zazara, 64, and his wife Maxine, 44. He shot Vincent in the head while he slept. He then bound and assaulted Maxine, demanding to know where valuables were kept. When she resisted and fought back, he stabbed her repeatedly. He mutilated her body and gouged out her eyes, placing them in a jewelry box. A grotesque act that shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. May 14th, 1985. Ramirez entered the Monterey Park home of Bill Doy, 66, and his wife Lillian, 56. He shot Bill in the head and assaulted Lillian, threatening her life if she screamed. Bill Doy died later at the hospital. July 2nd, 1985. Ramirez broke into the Arcadia home of Mary Louise Cannon, 75, a retired grandmother. He beat her with a lamp and stabbed her repeatedly with a kitchen knife. She was found dead in her bedroom. Each crime added to the mounting hysteria. The news media dubbed him the Valley Intruder, then the Walk-In Killer, before settling on the name that would forever be associated with him, the Night Stalker. Victims without pattern. Perhaps most disturbing was the wide age range of his victims, from a 9-year-old girl to an 83-year-old grandmother. In several cases, children were taken from their homes, molested, and then released, traumatized but alive. He once kidnapped a young girl, assaulted her, and left her miles away in a basement, instructing her to wait quietly. The randomness of these acts, both sparing and killing, sometimes without any sexual component, sometimes with brutal sexual sadism, made it impossible to profile him in traditional terms. Some survivors remembered his face, gaunt, with rotting teeth, a foul smell, eyes that seemed empty or not human. They described the scent of death and decay surrounding him, his bizarre speech, and his obsession with Satan. Many said he forced them to pray to the devil or swear on Satan to obey him. Ramirez and Satanism. Ramirez didn't just see himself as a killer, he believed he was doing the devil's work. He spoke openly of Satan. He drew pentagrams. He carved them into victims and walls. He invoked the devil before attacks. He wore a black baseball cap embroidered with a pentagram. Some detectives believed his satanic beliefs were part of a personal mythology, a way to justify the evil he already wanted to commit. Others saw it as genuine delusion, perhaps fueled by years of drug use and trauma. In interviews and letters, Ramirez often talked about being a servant of hell, saying things like, "Satan is the ultimate rebel, the real ruler of the world. God is a lie. And I don't need forgiveness. I didn't sin. I served my master." Whether it was a mask, a delusion, or true belief, it fed into the terror he created. For victims and the public, he wasn't just a killer, he was evil incarnate. California in a state of panic. As the months wore on and bodies continued to appear, the city of Los Angeles, and eventually all of California, descended into panic. Many people were too afraid to sleep. Children were no longer allowed to play outside in the evenings. Entire neighborhoods stopped trusting strangers. The LAPD and other law enforcement agencies were overwhelmed. Ramirez didn't stay in one place. He attacked in Los Angeles, the San Gabriel Valley, Glendale, San Francisco. He even committed one murder in Mission Viejo, south of LA. He left no fingerprints, or so police thought. He used gloves. He sometimes used his shirt to wipe down doorknobs and surfaces. When prints were found, they often didn't match any in existing databases, until a lucky break changed that. A killer without mercy. One of the clearest signs of Ramirez's true nature was the joy he took in others' suffering. He wasn't simply a thief who killed when surprised. He was a predator. He told victims he liked to watch them scream. He would taunt them. He made some beg for their lives, only to shoot or stab them anyway. In the end, it wasn't about money or even power. It was about control. About watching people lose everything in a moment. Their sense of safety, their dignity, their lives. Ramirez seemed to believe fear was the purest form of expression. He once told a jailhouse visitor, "Fear is freedom. It means they know who's in control." Setting the stage for the hunt. By the summer of 1985, the pressure on law enforcement had reached a boiling point. Victims were piling up. Citizens were forming mobs and organizing checkpoints. The media was pushing for answers. Investigators were desperate. Then came the break they needed. A shoe print, then a bullet match, then a partial fingerprint. Piece by piece, the shadow that was Richard Ramirez began to take shape. closing in. By the summer of 1985, the Los Angeles Police Department and the Sheriff's Department were working around the clock. Citizens were terrified, and the press was relentless. Every few nights, it seemed, another brutal attack or murder was attributed to the Night Stalker. Investigators had little to go on. He left few witnesses alive, no clear pattern, and his choice of weapons and methods varied so much that even seasoned detectives struggled to link the crimes. But small clues began to accumulate. The evidence mounts. One of the first breakthroughs came from a shoe print. At one crime scene, detectives noticed an Avia sneaker imprint left in a pool of blood. That same distinctive tread pattern appeared at several other scenes. Investigators were able to confirm that the print came from a rare model of sneaker, fewer than 1,500 pairs sold in the United States at the time, which gave them confidence they were hunting the same man. Then came ballistics evidence. Bullets recovered from different victims matched the same .22 caliber revolver. Finally, detectives discovered a fingerprint at one crime scene. At first it yielded nothing, but when they cross-referenced it to known offenders in the system, the name Richard Ramirez came up. He had prior arrests for burglary and possession of drugs. The public awakens. By late August 1985, authorities decided to release Ramirez's name and photograph to the public. They hoped that by making his face known, someone would spot him. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez boarded a bus to Tucson, Arizona, to visit his brother. Unaware that his face was now on every television and newspaper in California, he returned 2 days later. At the Greyhound bus station in East Los Angeles, he noticed people staring at him strangely. He saw his own face on the front page of the paper in a vending machine, and ran. The capture. Ramirez fled through the streets, attempting to steal a car and then carjack a woman. But by this point, the community itself had turned against him. Residents recognized him, shouting, "El Matador," the killer, and chasing him through the neighborhood. One man hit him with a metal bar. Others joined in, beating him bloody before police arrived. By the time officers pulled him away from the angry mob, Ramirez was bruised, battered, and handcuffed. He had been caught not by detectives, but by the very people he had terrorized. Aftermath. Even as he was being arrested, Ramirez seemed unrepentant. He sneered and smiled at the cameras, flashing a pentagram he had carved into his palm. Later, he told reporters, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." The hunt was over, but the trial, and the spectacle it became, had only just begun. Courtroom spectacle. When Richard Ramirez was brought to trial in 1988, nearly 3 years after his arrest, it was clear this would be no ordinary proceeding. What unfolded in that Los Angeles courtroom was part criminal trial, part media circus, and part unsettling theater. From the moment he entered the courthouse, his thin frame clad in black, long dark hair framing his gaunt face, sunglasses covering his eyes, Ramirez seemed to embrace his notoriety. He smirked at reporters, flashed a pentagram carved into the palm of his hand, and frequently shouted, "Hail Satan," during hearings. He often smiled and waved to spectators, many of whom were not there for justice, but for a glimpse of infamy. Young women, nicknamed Night Stalker groupies, attended daily, sending him letters of devotion, blowing kisses, and even baring themselves in hopes of catching his attention. One woman wrote to him, "You are misunderstood, Richard. You are dark and dangerous, and I love you for it." The press documented everything. feeding a fascination that blurred the line between justice and spectacle. The evidence presented. Despite his defiance, the evidence against Ramirez was overwhelming. Forensic links. The Avia sneaker print was matched to his shoes, a unique and rare model tied to multiple crime scenes. Ballistics. Bullets fired from his revolver were matched to victims. Fingerprints. His prints were found on stolen vehicles and at crime scenes. Witness testimony. Several survivors, including children he had molested and spared, identified him in court. Stolen property. Items taken from victims' homes were found in his possession or pawned by him. As photographs of the grisly crime scenes were shown to the jury, Ramirez often laughed or whispered to himself. Survivors who testified spoke of his cruelty, of how he made them pray to Satan or taunted them as they wept. The jury listened to weeks of harrowing testimony, punctuated by Ramirez's bizarre outbursts and devil-may-care attitude. A strange charisma. For all his depravity, Ramirez held an unsettling allure, especially to certain women who seemed drawn to his rebellious image and dangerous aura. He received hundreds of letters from admirers while on trial, and at least one juror admitted to feeling unnerved by his presence. Psychologists later speculated that Ramirez embodied the archetype of the dark romantic, someone who projected danger, rebellion, and mystery, a figure who, to some, became perversely attractive despite his monstrous acts. But to the victims' families, he was not a romantic. He was the embodiment of evil. A chilling finale. On September 20th, 1989, after more than a year of testimony and deliberations, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on 43 counts, including 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. When the death sentence was handed down, Ramirez sneered and said, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." He was sentenced to die in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. But Ramirez would spend the next 23 years on death row, appealing his sentence, corresponding with admirers, and granting interviews where he continued to profess allegiance to Satan. After the verdict. Even after his conviction, Ramirez remained a source of morbid fascination. He married a woman named Doreen Leoy in 1996, who described him as her soulmate and claimed he was misunderstood. Meanwhile, his victims' families continued to live with the pain he had inflicted, their lives forever scarred by his violence. Many of them spoke at the sentencing hearing, condemning him as a coward and a monster. In 2013, before his sentence could be carried out, Richard Ramirez died of complications from B-cell lymphoma at Marin General Hospital. At 53 years old, he left behind a legacy of terror, fascination, and an enduring question. How could a human being sink so deep into darkness? Legacy of the trial. Ramirez's trial remains one of the most infamous in American criminal history, not just for its grisly details, but for what it revealed about society's obsession with evil. In the end, the trial gave voice to the survivors, brought closure to the families, and showed that even the most terrifying predators can be brought to justice. Inside the mind of the Night Stalker. What turns a quiet child into a remorseless killer? Forensic psychologists, criminologists, and journalists have spent decades trying to understand Richard Ramirez. His crimes seemed fueled by rage, lust, and a fascination with death. But behind them lay a complex web of trauma, mental illness, and choice. Ramirez was not simply a thief who escalated to violence, nor was he an impulsive murderer with no thought to his actions. He was a rare and terrifying blend, a psychopathic sadist who seemed to enjoy not just killing, but instilling terror, humiliation, and pain in others. childhood and early trauma. Experts agree that Ramirez's upbringing was steeped in violence and dysfunction. Abuse at home, his father's beatings, his mother's exposure to toxic chemicals during pregnancy, and his family's chaotic home life all created a foundation of fear and instability. Head injuries. 2 severe head traumas by the age of 5, both resulting in unconsciousness, may have caused lasting damage to the parts of his brain responsible for impulse control and empathy. Seizures. Childhood epilepsy, which persisted into his teens, often left him feeling vulnerable and alienated from his peers. Influence of Miguel. Perhaps most significant was the impact of his cousin Miguel, whose stories and photos of violence during the Vietnam War became a twisted guidebook for the young Ramirez. Witnessing Miguel murder his wife at age 12 and seeing how little consequence followed may have taught Richard that life was cheap and violence was power, a love of darkness. From an early age, Ramirez developed a fascination with death, horror, and the occult. He slept in cemeteries, read about Satanism, and fantasized about violence. As he grew older, these interests deepened into a worldview that celebrated chaos and destruction. To him, Satan was not just a religious figure, but a symbol of ultimate rebellion, defiance against authority, morality, and society itself. He wore pentagrams, invoked the devil at crime scenes, and forced victims to pray to Satan as he assaulted them. Whether his Satanism was genuine belief, psychosis, or merely a justification for his actions remains debated. Some psychologists argue that Ramirez crafted a diabolical persona to make himself seem powerful and beyond human judgment. Psychopathic traits. Ramirez showed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, also known as psychopathy, lack of empathy or remorse, manipulativeness and charm, impulsive, thrill-seeking behavior, aggression and cruelty toward others, disregard for laws and social norms. What set him apart even among killers was the joy he seemed to take in his victims' suffering. He didn't simply want to kill, he wanted to dominate, to watch his victims beg, to inflict psychological and physical torment. This sadistic streak suggests he derived sexual gratification from causing pain, a hallmark of a sexual sadist. Drugs, delusions, and decline. By the time he arrived in Los Angeles, Ramirez was a heavy user of cocaine, LSD, and marijuana. The drugs likely amplified his paranoia, aggression, and detachment from reality. Some survivors reported hearing him mutter to himself during attacks, as if responding to unseen voices. He spoke of demons in the corners of rooms, of being watched and rewarded by dark forces. While he was never formally diagnosed with schizophrenia, some of his behavior, the hallucinations, the delusions of grandeur, the belief in demonic guidance, suggest psychotic features, perhaps exacerbated by his drug use. Why did he kill? Was Ramirez born evil, or was he made that way? The answer is complicated. His abusive childhood, traumatic brain injuries, exposure to violence, social alienation, and substance abuse all played roles in shaping his psyche. But at some point, he chose to embrace the darkness rather than resist it. Many killers have endured hardship without becoming murderers. Ramirez, however, seemed to revel in his identity as a predator. In his own words, "We are all evil. Some of us are more honest about it." The aftermath. Even after his death in 2013, Ramirez continues to fascinate and disturb. He has been the subject of books, documentaries, and studies in criminal psychology. His case is taught as an example of how early intervention might prevent future violence, and as a warning of what happens when no one intervenes. To his victims, he was the embodiment of their darkest fears. To the city of Los Angeles, he was proof that monsters walk among us. To himself, he was the chosen of Satan, and perhaps in his mind, victorious even in defeat. Final reflection. Richard Ramirez's story is more than the story of a killer. It is the story of fear, chaos, and the fragile illusion of safety we all believe in. When it cracks, when the darkness comes, we see what lies beneath, and it stares back with black, empty eyes. The long shadow of the night stalker. When Richard Ramirez died in a hospital bed on June 7th, 2013, after nearly 24 years on death row, the news brought mixed feelings to those who had lived through his reign of terror. Some felt relief that his name would no longer appear in headlines. Others felt cheated that he never faced execution. For the families of his victims, there was no closure, only the quiet, unending ache of loss. But his death did not erase what he had done. Even now, decades after his crimes, the name Night Stalker still sends a chill through California. His face, gaunt, smirking, eyes empty, remains one of the most recognizable in the dark pantheon of serial killers. The fear that remained. For a year between 1984 and 1985, California had lived in fear. People changed the way they lived. They double-locked doors, nailed windows shut, bought guns, and kept children inside at dusk. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to one another now organized watches and patrolled their streets at night. Ramirez had reminded everyone that safety is an illusion, that no lock is unbreakable, no neighborhood truly immune to the predator who watches and waits. One survivor later said, "We didn't sleep. For months, no one slept. We all thought he was coming for us next." And that fear, even long after his capture, lingered in the corners of people's minds. Why we look back? Why do we still talk about Richard Ramirez? Why does his story, like that of Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy, or the Zodiac Killer, continue to fascinate and horrify? Perhaps because he represents the darkest possibilities within human nature. The capacity to hurt others, not for survival or revenge, but simply because one can. He wore his evil openly. He embraced it. And in doing so, he forced society to confront its own fascination with darkness. There is a morbid curiosity in understanding someone like Ramirez, a need to dissect the monster, to try to make sense of the senseless. We study him hoping to prevent the next one, but also because something in us cannot look away. Lessons learned. Ramirez's case also changed the way police and the public respond to violent crime. It underscored the importance of interagency cooperation. It highlighted how forensic evidence, shoe prints, ballistics, fingerprints, could piece together a seemingly random pattern. It showed the power of the public when engaged, as it was ultimately an angry crowd that apprehended him. And it served as a sobering reminder that predators don't always fit a pattern. Sometimes they are unpredictable, and that makes them all the more dangerous. Remembering the victims, most importantly, we must remember that the story of the Night Stalker is not his alone. It is the story of the people he hurt and killed, the families shattered, the lives ended too soon. Their names are not as famous as his, but they are the ones who matter most. Each victim was more than a headline. They were mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, neighbors, friends, and their memories deserve to outshine the darkness he cast. A final thought. In the end, Richard Ramirez did not win. The fear he created faded. The city he terrorized endured. The families he hurt found ways to keep living. And though he sought to become immortal through infamy, history remembers him not as powerful, but as broken. A man who chose to embrace the void within himself, and in doing so, became what he worshipped: empty, cold, and forgotten. The devil in Los Angeles. Los Angeles healed. The sun rose again. But somewhere, in the quiet of a darkened room, a shadow still lingers. A whisper that evil can find its way through any crack, no matter how small. And so, we lock our doors, check our windows, and hope the monsters stay outside. Because the scariest truth of all is that the monster is human.